My name is Rebecca Michelle Torres. I'm 34 years old, a nurse practitioner at Denver General Medical Center, and 3 weeks ago, my husband destroyed everything I thought I knew about our life together with 7 words that still echo in my head every morning when I wake up. Becca, I'm HIV positive from surgery. Those words didn't just change my medical status or our marriage plans. They rewrote the entire story of who I thought I was married to, and by the time I discovered the truth, I realized I'd been living with a stranger for 8 years. Let me back up because this story doesn't start with an HIV diagnosis or a devastating phone call from another woman. It starts in a coffee shop in Boulder, Colorado 8 years ago, where I met David Miguel Torres during my final year of nursing school. He was 29 then, a financial advisor with kind eyes and a smile that made me forget I had studying to do. I was 26, exhausted from clinical rotations and convinced I'd never have time for a serious relationship until after graduation. David changed all of that. He showed up at the hospital cafeteria during my break times with homemade sandwiches. He picked me up after 16-hour shifts and drove me home while I fell asleep in his passenger seat. When I was studying for my boards, he brought me coffee and quiz cards and sat quietly in the corner of my apartment, just being there while I stressed about my future. "You're going to be an incredible nurse," he told me the night before my licensing exam, his hands rubbing the tension from my shoulders as I hunched over yet another practice test. "You care about people in a way that most people don't. You see their pain and you actually want to fix it." Our wedding was small but perfect. My parents, both retired teachers from small-town Nebraska, were thrilled that I'd found someone stable and kind. David's family, Mexican-American and deeply Catholic, welcomed me with open arms despite my pale Irish complexion and my terrible Spanish. His mother, Carmen, spent weeks teaching me how to make his favorite mole recipe, laughing every time I mispronounced the ingredients. I should have listened more carefully to that warning. I should have asked what she meant about David trying to make people happy at the expense of honesty. But I was 27, newly married, and convinced that love could solve any problem if you just worked hard enough at it. The first 3 years of our marriage were everything I'd hoped for. David's financial planning business grew steadily, bringing in clients who trusted his careful approach to long-term investments. I started working at Denver General, first in the emergency department, then transitioning to a nurse practitioner role in the family clinic. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with a big backyard that we imagined filling with children someday. "I want to be the dad who coaches Little League," he told me one evening as we painted the room that would eventually become a nursery. "I want to teach them how to ride bikes and help them with algebra homework. My dad was 45 when I was born and he was always tired. I want to be different." Looking back, I can see how that desire to be different, to be better, to be perfect, was the crack in David's foundation that eventually split our entire marriage in half. But at the time, it just seemed like the normal dreams of a man who loved the idea of family. The problems started slowly, so gradually that I didn't recognize them as problems at first. David began working later, staying at the office until 8 or 9 p.m. several nights a week. When I asked about it, he explained that he was taking on more corporate clients, bigger accounts that required evening meetings and weekend presentations. "It's just temporary," he assured me, kissing my forehead as I sat at our kitchen table eating dinner alone again. "Once I get these accounts established, I'll be able to delegate more. But right now, I need to prove myself." "You deserve beautiful things," he told me when I protested about the cost. "You work so hard taking care of everyone else. Let me take care of you." The business trips became more frequent, sometimes twice a month. David would be gone for 3 or 4 days, attending conferences or meeting with potential clients in other states. He always called me every night, usually around 10 p.m. my time, to tell me about his day and ask about mine. "I miss you," he would say, and I could hear the television in his hotel room, the sounds of late-night talk shows or movie channels. "I can't wait to get home to you." By our 5th anniversary, the late nights and business trips had become our normal routine. I adapted because that's what you do in marriage. You adapt to the seasons of your partner's career, their ambitions, their struggles. David was building something important, creating financial security for our future family. My job was stable, predictable, Monday through Friday with occasional weekend shifts. His job was more demanding, more unpredictable, but also more lucrative. I threw myself into my own career during this time, taking on additional training in women's health and contraceptive counseling. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping other women plan their pregnancies while my own fertility window was slowly closing. At 32, I started bringing up children more urgently. He looked up from his computer, that same loving smile I'd fallen for years ago. You're right, babe. Let me just finish up this big project I'm working on, get through the next quarter, and then we can really focus on starting our family. I want to be present for that, not distracted by work stress. Another delay, another perfectly reasonable explanation. I marked my calendar for 3 months later and started taking prenatal vitamins, preparing my body for pregnancy while David prepared for yet another business expansion. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in November, almost exactly 2 years ago. I was working a late shift at the clinic when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Usually I wouldn't answer unknown calls during work hours, but something made me pick up. Is this Rebecca Torres? The voice was professional, clinical. This is Dr. Amanda Rodriguez at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. Your husband David Torres has been in a serious car accident. You need to come immediately. When I arrived at the emergency department, Dr. Rodriguez met me in the waiting room. She was young, probably my age, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much trauma. Don't worry about anything work-related, Marcus assured me as we sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs. I'll handle all his clients, reschedule everything. He just needs to focus on getting better. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from surgery at 2 a.m., still in her surgical scrubs but with better news than I'd dared hope for. The surgery went well, she reported to our small group of worried family members. We were able to repair the spleen and stop the internal bleeding. There was significant blood loss, but we were able to maintain his blood pressure with 4 fluids and plasma expanders. He's stable now and should make a full recovery. David spent 4 days in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness from the pain medication. When he was awake, he was David again, grateful, loving, worried about being a burden. He thanked every nurse who adjusted his fore, apologized to me for scaring me, and promised his parents that he would be more careful driving in the future. I believed him. I wanted so desperately for things to be different, for us to get back to the closeness we'd shared in our early years. The accident felt like a wake-up call, a chance for us to refocus on what really mattered. For about 6 months after David's recovery, things were different. Better. He came home for dinner more often, turned down some business trips, and started talking seriously about starting our family. We even began trying to conceive, charting my cycles and timing our intimacy with the precision of 2 people who had decided that parenthood was their next important project. But gradually, imperceptibly, the old patterns crept back in. Late nights at the office. Weekend client meetings. Business trips that seemed to multiply like weeds. By the time David's 1-year anniversary of the accident arrived, we were back to our routine of ships passing in the night. It's just the nature of the business, David explained when I brought up my concerns during one of our increasingly rare dinner dates. You know, I'd rather be home with you, but these clients expect availability. It's how we're able to afford this lifestyle, how we'll be able to afford childcare when we have kids. The mention of children was becoming a sore spot between us. At 33, with a year of unsuccessful trying behind us, I was starting to wonder if we should see a fertility specialist. But David kept postponing the appointment, claiming work stress and promising we'd address it after the next big project, the next quarterly review, the next whatever. I threw myself deeper into my own work, taking on additional responsibilities at the clinic and starting to specialize in reproductive health counseling. There was something both ironic and therapeutic about helping other women navigate pregnancy, contraception, and fertility issues while my own reproductive life felt stalled and neutral. It was through this work that I met Dr. Susan Martinez, a reproductive endocrinologist who would later become crucial to unraveling David's web of lies. Dr. Martinez consulted at our clinic twice a month, seeing patients who needed more specialized care than our general practice could provide. "Rebecca," she said after we'd worked together on several complex cases, "you have a real gift for this work. Have you ever considered specializing further in women's reproductive health? I think you'd be excellent in an infertility clinic." I was flattered and interested, but also aware that additional training would mean more time away from home, more pressure on my marriage to a husband who was already absent more than present. "I'll think about it," I told her, which is what I said about most opportunities that required David and me to have serious conversations about our future plans. Those conversations never happened, or when they did, they were brief and postponed by David's next crisis at work, his next big opportunity, his next reason why everything else had to wait. Looking back, I can see how perfectly David had constructed a life that gave him maximum freedom while keeping me locked in place by hope, by planning, by the constant promise that our real life together was just around the corner after the next thing. But I didn't see it then. I saw a hard-working husband building financial security for our future family. I saw temporary sacrifices that would pay off in the long run. I saw a man who loved me and wanted to provide for me, even if the providing seemed to require him to be away from me most of the time. The diagnosis conversation happened on a Thursday evening in October, almost exactly 3 weeks ago now. I was in our bedroom, sitting cross-legged on our king-size bed, folding the laundry that had been sitting in baskets for 3 days. David had been working late again, something about a crisis with a major client that required immediate attention. When I heard his car in the driveway at 9:30 p.m., I felt the familiar mix of relief and resentment that had become my default response to his arrivals. Relief that he was home safe, resentment that dinner had gone cold hours ago, that I'd spent another evening alone, that our conversations had been reduced to text messages and brief phone calls. David walked into our bedroom looking pale and shaken, more upset than I'd seen him since his accident recovery. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, his shirt wrinkled like he'd been running his hands through the fabric all day. "Becca," he said, sitting heavily on the edge of our bed, "I need to tell you something important. Something that's going to change everything for us." "What's wrong?" I asked, reaching for his hand. "Are you sick? Did something happen at work?" He pulled his hand away gently, and that small rejection sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October weather outside our windows. "I had some routine blood work done at my annual physical last week," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Martinez called me today with the results." My mind immediately went to the worst possibilities: cancer, heart disease, kidney problems. David was only 37, seemingly healthy except for the occasional back pain from his car accident. But men his age could develop serious conditions without obvious symptoms. "David, what did the test show?" He looked directly at me then, his brown eyes filled with what I interpreted as shame and fear but would later recognize as guilt and calculation. "I'm HIV positive, Becca. Dr. Martinez says I probably contracted it during my surgery 2 years ago, from contaminated blood transfusions. She said it's rare, but it happens sometimes when screening procedures miss infections that are too recent to detect." The world tilted sideways. I felt like I was falling through space, like gravity had suddenly reversed and I was plummeting upward into a sky that had no ceiling. The laundry basket slipped from my hands, sending clothes scattering across our hardwood floor like pieces of a life that had just been torn apart. "HIV positive," I repeated, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "From a blood transfusion during your surgery." "I had the blood work done on Tuesday," David said, watching me pace with eyes that seemed to be calculating something. "Dr. Martinez said my viral load is detectable but not extremely high. She wants to start me on treatment immediately and she said..." He paused, swallowing hard. "She said you need to be tested immediately too." "How long has it been since your surgery?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. 23 months, David replied quietly. "I need to call Dr. Kim immediately," I said, referring to my own physician. "I need immediate testing, post-exposure prophylaxis, a complete STD panel. David, this is..." I couldn't finish the sentence. This was catastrophic. This was life-altering. This was the end of our plans for children, for a normal future, for everything we had been building together. "Becca, please," he said, his voice breaking. "I know this is terrible. I know this changes everything. But people live normal lives with HIV now. The treatments are amazing. It doesn't have to be a death sentence." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling while David slept fitfully beside me, and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My mind kept cycling through the same questions. How had this happened? Why hadn't the hospital's screening procedures caught contaminated blood? What did this mean for our marriage, our future, our dreams of having children? The next morning I called in sick to work and drove straight to my doctor's office. Dr. Sarah Kim had been my physician for over 5 years, and she knew me well enough to recognize that something was seriously wrong when I called and asked for an emergency appointment. The waiting room at the lab felt surreal. I sat surrounded by people getting routine blood work for annual physicals, cholesterol checks, diabetes monitoring, normal medical maintenance for normal lives. Meanwhile, I was there to find out whether my life as I knew it was over. "I want you to see Dr. Martinez as soon as possible," Dr. Kim said as she walked me to the checkout desk. "She specializes in HIV prevention and treatment, and she'll be able to give you the most current information about your risk levels and monitoring protocols." Driving home from the doctor's office, I felt like I was moving through a world that looked the same but had fundamentally changed. The coffee shop where David and I had met looked the same, but now it was the place where I'd fallen in love with someone who would unknowingly expose me to HIV. Our neighborhood looked the same, but now the house we'd bought together was the place where I'd been living with contaminated blood for almost 2 years. I spent the afternoon researching HIV transmission, treatment protocols, and long-term prognosis, approaching it with the same thoroughness I brought to any medical research. The information was both reassuring and terrifying. Modern antiretroviral therapy had transformed HIV from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition. People with HIV could live normal lifespans, have healthy children, maintain intimate relationships with proper precautions. But it was still HIV. It was still a virus that would require daily medication, regular monitoring, careful disclosure to partners, and complex family planning. It would still be a factor in every intimate relationship, every pregnancy decision, every routine medical appointment for the rest of my life. When David came home that evening, I was sitting at our dining room table surrounded by printed research articles, medical journals, and notes from my appointments that day. "How did it go with Dr. Kim?" he asked, sitting down across from me with the careful distance of someone who knew he was in dangerous territory. "She started me on post-exposure prophylaxis and ordered comprehensive testing," I replied without looking up from the article I was reading. "I have an appointment with Dr. Martinez next week to discuss long-term monitoring and risk assessment." David reached across the table and tried to take my hand, but I moved it away automatically. "David, I need you to help me understand something," I said carefully. "Walk me through the timeline of your surgery. What exactly do you remember about the blood transfusions?" For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. But it was so brief I thought I'd imagined it. "I don't remember much from the surgery itself," he said. "I was unconscious for most of it. But Dr. Rodriguez told me afterward that I'd lost a significant amount of blood and needed transfusions to stabilize me. She said it was touch and go for a while." I nodded, making notes on the legal pad I'd been using to track information. "Do you remember how many units of blood you received? Did they mention anything about the source of the blood or any concerns about screening?" David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't remember specific details like that. I was pretty out of it for the first few days." "Why are you asking?" "Because I want to understand how this happened," I replied. "If there was a breakdown in blood screening procedures, the hospital needs to know. Other patients could be at risk. There might be other people who received blood from the same contaminated donations." The idea hadn't occurred to me until that moment, but suddenly it seemed crucial. If David's HIV infection had come from contaminated blood that had somehow slipped through screening procedures, there could be other victims. Other patients who had received transfusions around the same time. Other families dealing with the same devastating news we were processing. "Maybe I should call Dr. Rodriguez and ask for more specific information about the blood you received," I continued. "She might have records about the donation source, the screening process, whether there were any other cases." David's response was immediate and vehement. "No," he said quickly. "I don't want to deal with hospitals and investigations and all of that right now. I just want to focus on our health, on figuring out how to manage this going forward. Getting dragged into some hospital investigation isn't going to change what's already happened." His reaction surprised me. As someone who worked in healthcare, I knew that investigating potential blood contamination was a serious matter, something that hospitals and blood banks took extremely seriously. If there had been a breakdown in screening procedures, it was crucial to identify and address it quickly. "David, this isn't about getting dragged into anything," I said gently. This is about making sure other people don't go through what we're going through. If there's a problem with blood screening, it needs to be identified and fixed. I understand that, David replied, his tone becoming defensive. But I'm not ready to turn this into a big medical investigation. I just found out I'm HIV positive. I'm trying to wrap my head around what that means for us, for our future. I don't have the emotional energy to deal with hospital lawyers and investigations and all of that. I could understand his reluctance from an emotional perspective, but something about his response felt off to me. David had always been civic-minded, the kind of person who would want to prevent others from suffering the same harm he'd experienced. His immediate resistance to investigating the source of his infection seemed out of character. But I was dealing with my own emotional overload, my own fear and uncertainty about what our future looked like. I decided to let the investigation question rest for the moment and focus on the immediate medical issues we needed to address. The appointment with Dr. Martinez was scheduled for the following Friday, a week that felt like it lasted a month. I went through the motions of working, seeing patients, providing medical care, all while carrying the secret knowledge that I might be HIV positive myself. The irony was overwhelming. I was counseling women about sexual health and safety while dealing with my own potential infection. Dr. Martinez's office was in a modern medical building near Presbyterian Joseph Hospital, the same facility where David had been treated after his accident. As I sat in the waiting room, I wondered if I was following the same path David had walked when he received his diagnosis. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who delivered difficult news on a regular basis. Her office was warm and comfortable, with family photos on her desk and medical certificates covering one wall. "Rebecca," she said as I settled into the chair across from her desk, "I understand you're here because your husband recently received an HIV-positive diagnosis. Can you tell me what you know about his infection?" I repeated the story David had told me about contaminated blood transfusions during his surgery, watching Dr. Martinez's face for reactions as I spoke. She listened carefully, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions. "David told you that I was the doctor who diagnosed him?" she asked when I finished. "Yes, he said you called him with the test results from his annual physical." Dr. Martinez frowned slightly, checking something in her computer. "I'm sorry, Rebecca, but I think there might be some confusion. I haven't seen David as a patient. I didn't order his blood work or call him with any test results." The room went very quiet. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside the window, the tick of a clock on Dr. Martinez's bookshelf. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed to say. Dr. Martinez turned her computer screen toward me, showing an empty patient search result. "I've searched our system for David Torres and he's not in our database. He's never been a patient in our practice." My mind was struggling to process this information. David had specifically mentioned Dr. Martinez by name, had said she was the one who had called him with his HIV diagnosis. But she was telling me she'd never seen him as a patient. "Maybe there's another Dr. Martinez?" I asked weakly. "Maybe he's confused about which doctor called him?" Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "That's possible. There are several doctors with my last name in the Denver area. But Rebecca, I need to ask you something important. Are you absolutely certain that David is HIV positive? Have you seen his test results or any official documentation?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I realized that I hadn't seen any paperwork, any lab results, any official medical documentation of David's diagnosis. I had simply taken his word for it, accepted his explanation about contaminated blood transfusions, and immediately focused on my own testing and risk assessment. "No," I whispered. "I haven't seen any documentation. He just told me about the diagnosis and I believed him." Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "Rebecca, I think you should ask David to provide you with copies of his test results and medical records. If he's truly HIV positive, he should have official documentation from whatever doctor diagnosed him." I left Dr. Martinez's office in a state of confusion and growing suspicion. Why would David lie about being HIV positive? Why would he name a specific doctor who had never treated him? What was the purpose of creating such an elaborate deception? But even as these questions swirled in my mind, I found myself making excuses for David. Maybe he was confused about which doctor had called him. Maybe he was so upset by the diagnosis that he'd gotten the details wrong. Maybe there was a simple explanation for the discrepancy. When I arrived home that evening, David was already there, sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open, apparently working on client files. He looked up when I walked in, his expression expectant and worried. "How did the appointment go with Dr. Martinez?" he asked. I stood in our kitchen doorway, studying his face carefully as I spoke. "It was interesting," I said slowly. "She told me she's never treated you as a patient. She said she didn't call you with any test results." David's reaction was immediate and defensive. "That's impossible," he said, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. "She definitely called me. Maybe there's some mix-up in their computer system, or maybe she just doesn't remember. Doctors see a lot of patients. David, she checked her computer system thoroughly. You're not in their database at all. And Dr. Martinez specializes in infectious diseases. She doesn't see so many patients that she'd forget diagnosing someone with HIV." David stood up from the table, beginning to pace around our kitchen with nervous energy that I'd never seen before. "I don't know what to tell you, Becca. Maybe I got the name wrong. Maybe it was a different Dr. Martinez. All I know is that someone called me with test results, and those results showed that I'm HIV positive." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "Then show me the test results. Show me the lab reports, the paperwork from whoever diagnosed you. If you're HIV positive, you should have official medical documentation." David stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression becoming defensive and slightly angry. "Why are you interrogating me like this? I told you I have HIV. I told you it probably came from contaminated blood during my surgery. Why would I lie about something like that?" "I'm not interrogating you," I replied, though I realized that's exactly what I was doing. "I'm trying to understand what happened so we can make sure we're both getting proper medical care. If you really are HIV positive, I need to see your test results so I can understand your viral load, your treatment options, the timeline for my own testing." David sat back down at the table, putting his head in his hands. "The paperwork is at my office," he said finally. "I'll bring it home tomorrow. I've been trying not to think about it too much. Having the actual lab reports in front of me makes it feel more real, and I'm not ready for that yet." I wanted to believe him. I wanted there to be a simple explanation for the confusion with Dr. Martinez, for David's reluctance to show me documentation, for the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the story I'd been told. But my nursing background had taught me to trust evidence over explanations, documentation over stories, and facts over feelings. And the facts weren't adding up. That night, after David had gone to bed, I sat at my computer and began researching blood transfusion procedures at Presbyterian E. Joseph Hospital. What I found was reassuring from a general medical perspective but troubling for David's specific story. Presbyterian E. Joseph was a Level 1 trauma center with some of the most advanced blood screening procedures in the state. Their protocols exceeded federal requirements, with multiple layers of testing for HIV, hepatitis, and other blood-borne pathogens. The last documented case of HIV transmission through blood transfusion at the hospital had been in 1987, before modern screening procedures were implemented. More troubling was information I found about David's specific surgery. I was able to access his medical records through my hospital's shared database system, using my legitimate medical credentials to review the files of my own husband. What I found there contradicted everything David had told me about his treatment. According to the surgical notes from Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, David's surgery had been successful but hadn't required blood transfusions. His blood loss had been significant but not severe enough to necessitate transfused blood products. The surgical team had used 4 fluids and plasma expanders to maintain his blood pressure and fluid volume. There was no record of David receiving any blood products during his surgery or recovery. I stared at my computer screen, reading and rereading the surgical notes, trying to understand what this meant. David had built his entire HIV diagnosis story around contaminated blood transfusions that had never happened. Either the medical records were wrong, which seemed highly unlikely given the detailed documentation, or David had fabricated the entire story about how he'd contracted HIV. But why would someone lie about being HIV positive? What possible reason could David have for creating such an elaborate deception? I closed my laptop and sat in our dark living room, listening to the sound of David's breathing from our bedroom upstairs. Tomorrow he had promised to bring home documentation of his HIV diagnosis. Tomorrow I would finally see evidence of the medical crisis that had turned our marriage upside down. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. I went through the motions of seeing patients at the clinic, but my mind was constantly on David and his promised documentation. Every time my phone buzzed with a text message, I hoped it would be David saying he was on his way home with the lab reports that would explain everything. By the time I drove home that evening, I had made a decision. I was going to call Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital and speak directly with Dr. Rodriguez about David's surgery and recovery. If there had been blood transfusions that weren't properly documented, that was a serious medical issue that needed to be addressed. If there hadn't been blood transfusions, then David had some very serious explaining to do. Dr. Rodriguez remembered David's case clearly when I called her that evening. As the trauma surgeon who had saved his life, she had personal investment in his recovery and was happy to discuss his case with his wife. Mrs. Torres, I think there might be some confusion about David's treatment. He didn't receive any blood transfusions during or after his surgery. His blood loss was significant, but we were able to manage it with crystalloid fluids and plasma expanders. At no point did we administer any blood products. Completely certain. Blood transfusion is a serious procedure that requires extensive documentation and patient consent. If David had received blood products, it would be clearly noted throughout his medical record. I can have a copy of his complete surgical and recovery records sent to you if you'd like to review them yourself. Yes, please, I managed to say. I would appreciate that very much. After hanging up with Dr. Rodriguez, I sat in my car in our driveway for almost an hour, trying to process what I'd learned. David had lied about receiving blood transfusions. He had lied about how he contracted HIV. He had potentially lied about being HIV positive at all. But if he wasn't HIV positive, why create such an elaborate deception? What was the purpose of putting me through the terror of potential infection, the stress of extensive medical testing, the agony of believing our future had been destroyed by contaminated blood? David, I said as we stood in our kitchen, I spoke with Dr. Rodriguez today about your surgery. His reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale and he seemed to freeze for a moment before forcing a smile. Oh, what did she say? Is she doing well? Maybe she's misremembering, he said finally. It was almost 2 years ago and she probably does dozens of surgeries. Maybe she's thinking of a different case. David, trauma surgeons don't misremember whether they gave blood transfusions. It's a major medical intervention that requires extensive documentation. Dr. Rodriguez is sending me a copy of your complete medical records from the surgery. David's composure was beginning to crack. He sat down heavily at our kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. Okay. Maybe I was confused about some of the details. The whole experience was traumatic and I might have misunderstood what the doctors told me. So you're saying you misunderstood whether you received blood transfusions, and you also misunderstood which doctor diagnosed you with HIV, and you somehow can't produce any documentation of your diagnosis? I was no longer trying to hide my skepticism. David looked up at me with eyes that I suddenly didn't recognize. There was something calculating there, something cold that I'd never seen before. I'm not accusing you of anything, I replied. I'm asking you to show me proof that you're HIV positive. Lab results, medical records, prescription bottles, anything that confirms what you've told me. David stood up from the table and walked to our kitchen window, staring out into our backyard as if the answer to his problems might be hiding among our rose bushes. I can't, he said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. You can't what? I can't show you proof that I'm HIV positive. The admission hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I felt simultaneously vindicated and devastated, relieved to finally have the truth and horrified by what the truth meant. David, are you telling me you're not HIV positive? He turned around to face me and I could see that he was crying. Not the tears of someone who was sorry for what he'd done, but the tears of someone who was sorry he'd been caught. No, he whispered. I'm not HIV positive. I never was. The room started spinning around me. I gripped the edge of our kitchen counter, trying to anchor myself to something solid while my marriage collapsed completely around me. Then why? I asked. Why would you put me through this? Why would you make me believe I'd been exposed to HIV for 2 years? Why would you make me go through medical testing and take medication and plan for a completely different future? David was sobbing now, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his tears. When he looked up at me, his expression was desperate and pleading. Because I needed time, he said. I needed to figure out how to tell you the truth about what's really been happening. What truth, David? What's really been happening? And that's when he told me about Melissa. David's confession tumbled out of him in broken sentences and gasping sobs. A story so devastating that it made his HIV lie seem almost merciful by comparison. For the past 8 months, he had been having an affair with a pharmaceutical sales representative named Melissa Chong. They had met at a medical conference in Phoenix, where David had been presenting about financial planning for healthcare professionals. She was beautiful and young and interested in everything I said, David cried. I told her I was separated from you, that we were getting divorced, that I was free to start dating again. The affair had started as a one-night stand but quickly evolved into something more serious. David had been flying to Phoenix twice a month, supposedly for client meetings, but actually to spend long weekends with Melissa. He'd been buying her gifts, taking her on vacation trips, talking about a future together once his divorce was finalized. I know, David sobbed. I know how terrible this is. I kept telling myself I would end it with Melissa and come clean with you, but then she started talking about meeting you, about helping me through the divorce process. She wanted to be supportive, and I didn't know how to tell her that you didn't know I existed. The timeline was becoming clearer and more sickening. David had been living a double life for 8 months, convincing his mistress that his marriage was over while convincing me that our marriage was just going through a challenging phase due to his work demands. So why the HIV story? I asked. What does any of this have to do with making me think you're HIV positive? David's explanation was so twisted that I had to ask him to repeat it twice before I understood. 3 weeks ago, Melissa had discovered that she was HIV positive. She had immediately contacted David, demanding that he get tested and informing him that she was pregnant with his child. She was furious with me for not telling her I was married, David continued. She threatened to call you to tell you everything about our relationship. She said if I didn't handle the situation immediately, she would handle it herself. David's solution had been to create the HIV lie, hoping it would buy him time to figure out how to manage both relationships. He thought if he could convince me that he was HIV positive from contaminated blood, I would focus on medical issues rather than questioning his fidelity. He planned to string out the story for a few months while he convinced Melissa to have an abortion and disappear from his life. You thought you could manage both of us, I said, my voice barely controlled. You thought you could keep your pregnant mistress quiet while lying to me about having HIV. I know how insane it sounds, David said desperately. I was panicking. I couldn't figure out how to fix what I'd done without losing everything. So instead you decided to put me through hell. You decided to make me think I'd been exposed to a potentially fatal virus for 2 years. You made me take medication that made me sick, go through medical testing that terrified me, plan for a future where I might never be able to have children safely. David reached for me, trying to take my hands, but I stepped back sharply. Becca, please. I was trying to protect you from the truth because I knew it would destroy you. I thought if I could just fix the situation with Melissa quietly, we could go back to normal and you'd never have to know about any of this. Protect me. I laughed, a sound that was more like a bark of pure rage. You thought lying to me about HIV was protecting me? You thought making me believe our entire future was ruined by contaminated blood was better than telling me you'd been cheating on me for 8 months. That's when my phone rang. I looked at the caller ID and saw a number I didn't recognize, with a 480 area code that I knew was Phoenix, Arizona. For a moment, I considered not answering, but something told me this call was connected to the nightmare David had just described. Hello. I answered, putting the call on speaker so David could hear. Is this Rebecca Torres? The voice was female, young and shaky with emotion. My name is Melissa Chong. I need to talk to you about your husband. David's face went white as Melissa's voice filled our kitchen. I could see him calculating whether to run, whether to grab the phone, whether to try to stop the conversation that was about to happen. I'm listening, I said, keeping my eyes on David while I spoke to Melissa. I listened as Melissa told me essentially the same story David had just confessed, but from her perspective as the other woman who had also been lied to and deceived. She had believed David's story about his marriage being over. She had fallen in love with him, made plans for their future together, even gotten pregnant with his child before discovering his web of lies. And how exactly did he plan to handle the situation? I asked, though I already knew the answer from David's confession. He was going to tell you that he had HIV from a blood transfusion, then gradually break up with you over the next few months while I got an abortion and moved away. He thought if you believed he was sick, you'd be sympathetic rather than angry, and he could end the marriage without you ever knowing he'd been cheating. Because I can't do this anymore, she sobbed. I'm 8 months pregnant with his baby, I'm HIV positive, and he's been pressuring me to give up the baby for adoption and disappear from his life. He said if I ever contacted you or told anyone about our relationship, he would make sure I lost my job and my apartment. But I can't live with the lies anymore, especially now that there's a baby involved. 8 months pregnant. The timeline hit me like another physical blow. Melissa hadn't just been David's mistress for 8 months. She was carrying his child, a baby that would be born in just a few weeks. Melissa, are you absolutely certain that David is the father? I asked. Is there anything else? I asked David. Any other lies, any other women, any other children I should know about? That night, I packed a bag and drove to my friend Sarah's house, a fellow nurse who had been my closest confidant throughout nursing school and my early career. I sat at her kitchen table and told her the entire story, from David's fake HIV diagnosis to Melissa's pregnancy to the elaborate web of lies that had finally collapsed. I thought about that question for a long time. Looking back, there had been signs: the increased travel, the secrecy about his phone, the emotional distance that had grown between us over the past year. But I'd attributed all of it to work stress, to the natural challenges of a long marriage, to David's ambition and drive to provide for our future family. I think I saw what I wanted to see, I admitted. I wanted to believe that David was working hard for our future, so I ignored the evidence that he was actually building a future with someone else. Over the following days, the full scope of David's deception became clear. With Melissa's help, I was able to piece together not just the affair, but the financial implications of David's double life. He had been spending thousands of dollars on gifts, trips, and apartment rent for Melissa. He had taken out a second mortgage on our house without my knowledge, using the money to fund his Phoenix lifestyle. Rebecca, your husband has been living a double life for 8 months, and he's used marital assets to fund that double life without your knowledge or consent. In Colorado, that constitutes financial fraud. You have grounds for divorce based on adultery and financial misconduct. The HIV lie added another layer of legal complexity. In Colorado, knowingly exposing someone to HIV is a felony, but lying about having HIV isn't specifically criminalized. However, the psychological trauma David had inflicted by making me believe I was at risk could potentially be grounds for a civil lawsuit. What David did to you is a form of psychological abuse, Maria explained. He made you believe you were facing a life-threatening illness in order to cover up his infidelity. That kind of deliberate emotional manipulation could be considered intentional infliction of emotional distress under Colorado law. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. David's financial misconduct made it easy to prove that he had violated his fiduciary duty as a spouse. The court awarded me the house, the majority of our savings, and spousal support that would continue until I could rebuild my financial security. More importantly, the truth about David's character was finally fully revealed. During the discovery process, my attorney uncovered evidence of at least 2 other affairs over the past 3 years, both with women who believed David was single or separated. There were credit card charges for jewelry, dinners, and hotel rooms that David had hidden from me through a complex system of business accounts and cash advances. Your husband is a serial cheater, Maria told me after reviewing all the financial evidence. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake. This was a pattern of deliberate deception that goes back years. Melissa gave birth to a healthy daughter in March, 3 months after the truth came out. She named the baby Sophia and moved back to California to be closer to her family. Despite her HIV status, both Melissa and the baby were healthy, thanks to proper medical treatment during pregnancy. David was required to pay child support for Sophia, but Melissa made it clear that she didn't want him to have any parental rights or involvement in the baby's life. She was raising Sophia as a single mother, with help from her parents and a supportive community of other single mothers. "I don't want David anywhere near my daughter," Melissa told me during one of our phone conversations. "He's shown that he's willing to lie about anything, including serious medical conditions, to avoid taking responsibility for his choices. That's not the kind of person I want influencing my child." As for David's supposed HIV status, the irony was that he actually did need to get tested after his relationship with Melissa. When her positive test results came back, David had panicked, not about potentially being infected, but about how to manage the situation without his wife finding out about the affair. His test results came back negative, meaning he had somehow avoided infection despite having unprotected sex with an HIV-positive partner for several months. But the fear of infection had been real enough to drive him to create the elaborate blood transfusion lie rather than admit to adultery. "He was more afraid of you finding out about the affair than he was of actually having HIV," Dr. Martinez observed when I met with her again to discuss David's deception. "That tells you something important about his priorities and his character." 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I received a letter from David. He was living in a small apartment in Aurora, working for a different financial planning firm after being fired from his previous job when news of his fraud became public. He wanted to apologize, to explain his actions, to somehow make amends for what he'd put me through. I read the letter once and threw it away without responding. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, too elaborate to explain with apologies about fear and confusion. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life with the knowledge that I had survived something designed to break me. I went back to school part-time to get additional certification in psychiatric nursing, specializing in trauma recovery and intimate partner abuse. The work was challenging but meaningful in a way I'd never experienced before. I also started volunteering with an organization that helps women navigate divorce proceedings involving financial fraud and intimate partner deception. Every woman I help get justice for financial betrayal is a small victory against the kind of elaborate manipulation David had perpetrated. 1 year after my divorce, I met someone new. Dr. James Park, our emergency medicine physician who was recently divorced himself. We met at a medical conference where I was presenting about psychological trauma in healthcare settings, and we bonded over coffee about the challenges of rebuilding trust after betrayal. James knows my entire story: David's lies, the fake HIV diagnosis, the affairs, the financial fraud. He understands why I need complete transparency about medical history, financial status, and past relationships. More importantly, he provides that transparency without making me feel like I'm being unreasonable for requiring it. "You're not paranoid for wanting proof," he told me early in our relationship when I asked to see his recent STD test results and financial statements. "You're just someone who's learned that trust has to be earned through actions, not just words." We've been together for 6 months now, taking things slowly and building a foundation of honesty that I never had with David. James has never missed a phone call he said he'd make, never been anywhere he said he wouldn't be, never made me question whether his words match his actions. It's a different kind of love than what I had with David. Less passionate perhaps, but infinitely more secure. It's love built on truth rather than fantasy, on consistency rather than excitement, on respect rather than manipulation. The most important lesson I've learned from this experience is that medical deception is a form of assault, a violation of someone's right to make informed decisions about their own body and health. David didn't just lie to me about having HIV, he stole my ability to consent to the level of risk I was willing to accept in our relationship. David thought he could manage multiple lives through deception, compartmentalization, and manipulation. He thought he could avoid the natural consequences of his choices by creating increasingly complex lies. But deception always catches up eventually, usually through the most unexpected channels. In my case, it was a pregnant woman who finally found the courage to tell the truth when lying became more painful than facing reality. For others, it might be a medical record that doesn't match the story, a financial statement that reveals hidden spending, or simply the weight of maintaining lies becoming too heavy to bear. I'm grateful now for that devastating phone call from Melissa, even though it destroyed the life I thought I had. Because the life I thought I had was built on lies, manipulation, and elaborate deception. The life I have now is built on truth, even when that truth is painful. Sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the doorway to your most authentic life. Sometimes the lies that nearly destroy you become the foundation for a commitment to absolute honesty going forward. And sometimes the person who tries to control you through medical deception becomes the reason you finally learn to demand complete transparency in all your relationships. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how elaborate the lies designed to bury it. And when it does surface, you get to choose whether to keep living in the world of deception or step into the harder but infinitely more genuine world of truth. I chose truth. And despite everything David put me through, despite all the pain and fear and uncertainty his lies created, I've never regretted that choice for a single moment.